righty, we're on Exodus chapter 7. And, okay, there you are. Verse 1 says, Then Yahweh said to Moses, See, I make you Elohim to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. So, it's a simile, but the word as is not really there. He says, I'm going to make you Elohim to Pharaoh. The power of Elohim is going to seem to derive from Moses. Okay?
Scripture says,
A mighty one. Yeah, and which is what the word Elohim means. It means mighty one. In verses 2 and 3, you shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. Elohim is reaffirming to Moses that he is going to harden the heart of Pharaoh. Now, he mentioned that previously, too, in Exodus 4, verse 21. And Yahweh said to Moses, When you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. He has a lot of signs and wonders that he wants to display here. And in order to do that, he's got to harden Pharaoh's heart, make him keep the people there. Verses 4 and 5. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. Now, Egypt will know the name of Yahweh, and they'll know that he did these incredible things. Verse 6, So Moses and Aaron did it as Yahweh commanded them, thus they did. And Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, Work a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. You know, Moses and Aaron had already performed miracles in front of the elders of Israel. Now they're going to do these things in front of Pharaoh. The significance of the signs is to show that the true conflict is between Elohim and the gods of Egypt. Verse 10. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and thus they did just as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron threw his staff down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. For each one threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Okay, two of the magicians of Egypt were said to be Jannes and Jambres, and they were said to be two sons of Balaam. Now, verse 11 says, The sorcerers also made a rod turn into a serpent through their secret arts. Now, they're using incantations in order to make their trick appear powerful. But what they did was really a trick. Okay? Snake charmers in the Middle East still perform this deceptive trick of turning a rod into a serpent. I don't know if you're aware of that. They did it back then too. They induce a catatonic rigidity in the native cobra by exerting a strong pressure on the nerve just below its head. And the snake assumes a rod-like appearance and can even be handled by onlookers. But the jolt of being thrown to the ground restores its mobility. Now, this trick is documented as far back as 500 AD. So to say that they knew it 1,500 years earlier is probably about right. And there are a few snakes you can do this with. It's very effective with a few species of snakes, one of which is the Egyptian cobra. So, we read here, the magicians of Egypt in modern times have long been celebrated adepts in charming serpents, and particularly by pressing the nape of the neck, they throw them into a kind of catalepsy, which renders them stiff and immovable, thus seeming to change them into a rod. They conceal the serpent about their person, and by acts of legerdemain produce it from their dress, stiff and straight as a rod. Just the same trick was played off by their ancient predecessors, and so it appears they succeeded by their enchantments in practicing an illusion on the senses. So that's the trick. And there's a lot of sleight of hand involved. Up your sleeve, there it is. Throw it to the ground, it wakes up. There you are. Now, snakes here are a symbol of the power of Pharaoh as they are consumed by the rod of Aaron. They're also symbolic of Satan, where it says, in his power, death, which is swallowed up in victory. Yeah.
You just asked a question. I said, is there any symbolic of the snake swallowing them up? Just answered it.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Verses 13 and 14, yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as Yahweh had said. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, he refuses to let the people go. So Elohim hardens the heart of Pharaoh. He has great things in store to demonstrate to the world. Verse 15. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he's going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. And you'll say to him, Yahweh, the Elohim of the Hebrews, has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Thus says Yahweh, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, I'll strike the water that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it shall be turned to blood. Okay, the first 9 plagues form 3 groups of 3 plagues each. There's blood, frogs, and lice. Then there's flies, insects, and pestilence. Then there's boils, hail, and locusts, and also darkness. Now, the first plague in each group was announced in the morning. The second in each group is announced in Pharaoh's palace. The last in each group comes without warning. Now, by the third plague, the Egyptian magicians were put to shame and forced to see that Moses was the minister of the divine power greater than those gods of Egypt. Now, beginning with the fourth plague, the regions of Goshen were exempted from the plague. And that's where the Israelites were, thus confirming and identifying Moses' power as coming from the Elohim of Israel. By the sixth plague, the magicians themselves were afflicted, and they could not stand before Moses. After the ninth plague, Pharaoh breaks off all negotiations. The 10th plague, inflicted directly by Elohim himself, is the climax. Elohim demonstrated his complete superiority and left Pharaoh and his people without excuse. Now, this first plague, and by the way, we talk about these plagues, and in no way are we going to take away the supernatural on this. But keep in mind, with the supernatural, isn't the supernatural just a way of manipulating the natural?
Deceit.
Well, no, not deceit. Not deceit. Yeah, Elohim can take those rocks and turn them into sons of Israel. Yeah, we know that. But why would he not use a natural phenomenon to make these things happen? For instance, this first plague, it's a take on a well-known phenomenon that occurs periodically in the Nile Valley. The river is fed by melting snow and summer rains that pour down from the highlands of Ethiopia, and sediment from the tropical red earth characterizes that region, and it could be a bad case of sedimentation. I don't think that's the case. Some people have posited that. Does anyone know what red tide is? Okay. In this particular case, well, we'll keep moving here, and then I'll get to that. But right here, the interesting thing here, these 10 plagues, I think, were caused probably by something somewhat natural. There was an excellent documentary that was done by a gentleman that we've watched here that showed how all 10 plagues could have been caused by volcanic eruption from the north, which was documented to be about 1500 BC and just absolutely destroyed part of the world at that time. And we'll take a look at that too. It could be toxic algae that did this. We'll look at that. But the Exodus Decoded was that documentary. If anyone wants to look it up, I would highly recommend it. It's very well done. Exodus Decoded. Look at verse 18. And the fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. Now, the fact that the text says that the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile, that kind of leads it toward an algae infestation, possibly. But did he turn the water directly into blood? Maybe. Or to say that is what it looked like. Okay, I don't know if it was blood. Was it A positive? I mean, that's O negative. Yeah, the rare stuff. That's what. But blood doesn't seem to fit the context of the verse very well. Blood, literal blood, so to speak. Verses 19 and 20. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, and over their pools, and over all the reservoirs of water, that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone." So Moses and Aaron did even as Yahweh had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile, and in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile turned to blood. It was a long time ago that the water in the Nile, as it was overflowing, was delicious to the people. The water of Egypt, it was written, is so delicious that one would not wish the heat to be less or to be delivered from the sensation of thirst. The Turks found it exquisite, so much that they excite themselves for it by eating salt. A person, it was written, who never before heard of the deliciousness of the Nile water and of the large quantities on that account or drunk of it, I will, I'm sure, find it energy in these words of Moses to Pharaoh. The Egyptians shall loathe to drink the water of the Nile, which is something that never happened before. Verse 21, and the fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. Yeah.
Apparently this is not the red clay theory deal, because obviously it never happened before.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's the red clay theory. Right. However,
And it happened in the pools, and there were, besides the rivers and the
everything that was fed by the Nile.
yeah.
So it says all the water in the Nile turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul. When we talk about a red tide, this happens in different bodies of water, oceans and rivers, and in different parts of the world. Let's take a look at red tide for a second. It's a naturally occurring higher than normal concentration of the microscopic algae, Carenia brevis. This organism produces a toxin that affects the central nervous system of fish so that they're paralyzed and can't breathe. As a result, red tide blooms often result in dead fish washing up on Gulf beaches. When red tide algae reproduce in dense concentrations or blooms, they're visible as discolored patches of ocean water, often reddish in color. How, when, and where do red tide blooms start? As you can see, it looks like blood in many cases. Texas red tides have occurred from August through February. They typically begin in the Gulf of Mexico. Currents and winds then transport blooms toward shore. The blooms mainly come up along Gulf beaches and less frequently in bays and estuaries. Is it safe to eat fish that I catch in or near the red tide? It's usually okay to eat fish, crabs, and shrimp during a red tide bloom because the toxin's not absorbed into the fleshy tissues of these animals. This advice from the Texas Department of Health is based on the assumption that only the edible portions are being consumed, the fillet or muscle. Keep in mind you should never eat fish found sick or dead whether or not they're caught in a red tide. Is it safe to eat oysters during a red tide? Oysters and other shellfish, such as clams, mussels, whelks, and scallops, can accumulate red tide toxins in their tissues. People that eat oysters or other shellfish containing red tide toxins may become seriously ill with neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, NSP. Once a red tide appears to be over, toxins can remain in the oysters for weeks to months. For this reason, the Texas Department of Health closely monitors oyster growing areas for the presence of red tide and red tide toxins. TDH has the authority to close shellfish harvesting areas during and after a red tide. Oysters you buy from a restaurant or certified shellfish dealer should not have red tide toxins in them because of the TDH's monitoring program. There are, however, other risks associated with bacteria and other contaminants in raw oysters, but we know we shouldn't eat those anyway. And by the way, the pollution in all the bays in the world, you can directly relate that to the shellfish industry, harvesting all the shellfish out of the bays. They clean up the water. That's what they do. They absorb the toxins like you're seeing here. You take them out of the water, what's going to clean the water? Nothing. Yeah.
Humans.
Yeah, And then when you eat shellfish, what are you eating? The toxins that they absorb. Now, these are the results of red tides right here. And to look at a few of them, well, here it says red tide is a natural phenomenon not caused by human beings. When temperature, salinity, and nutrients reach certain levels, a massive increase in Karenia brevis algae occurs. No one knows the exact combination of factors that causes red tide, but some experts believe high temperatures combined with a lack of wind and rainfall are usually at the root of red tide blooms. There are no known ways that humans can control it, but many scientists around the world are studying red tide at present. It's important to remember that red tide has happened before, and the Texas marine environment has always recovered. But look at that. It's, you're talking about something that could be all-encompassing at times. And you saw what it did to the fish. And, well, there's in Hong Kong, Western Australia.
How come that water didn't dilute it?
There's too much of it.
You see it look like a line there.
Yeah, it's like there's a line there.
Same way that an oil spill
Yeah, like an oil spill.
coagulates these sort of.
Yep. And there's one, that's one in San Diego. Let's say at night some of those just glow. But you can see how it could be described as blood. If that indeed is what happened, it's just a good possibility. There's another possibility. Well, red tides here, a little bit more red tide information. It can occur anytime during the boating season if weather conditions are right. Dry, sunny spells followed by a sudden storm can encourage Alexandrium to multiply. Physical conditions such as winds, tides, and currents can act to contain and concentrate the organisms in one place, which didn't happen in this case. It filled the whole Nile, if that's what he used. When billions of organisms are present, they may tint the water. A red tide may suddenly appear in localized patches or longshore streamers. A few days or weeks later, the red color disappears. However, it should be noted that the water discoloration does not necessarily accompany the presence of toxic phytoplankton blooms. This has been especially true in the Gulf of Maine and off Canada. Some red tide organisms emit a bluish-green bioluminescent light that can make the waves glow at night. Then it says a few days or weeks later, the red color disappears. And we read in verse 25, 7 days passed after Yahweh had struck the Nile. So apparently it disappeared after 7 days. Just a thought. And then there's another thought. Just another thought. Have you ever heard of Lake Nyos? You know what a limnic eruption is? That's where water, it's overturned. Okay? Now, in Lake Nyos, an earthquake caused an iron oxide and CO2 buildup. And this is really what that documentary is based upon, that it caused this. And Lake Nyos, just to describe it to you here, in August of 1986, a huge cloud of CO2 was emitted from Lake Nyos in Cameroon. It's a lake on a volcano, okay? The suffocating gas cloud killed 1,700 villagers and thousands of livestock in one night. Scientists were initially puzzled, and locals blamed a spirit woman named Mammy Water, who lives in the lakes and rivers. Lake Niles lies within the Oku volcanic field and occupies a Mar crater formed from the eruption some 400 years ago. The volcanic activity beneath the lake continues, and CO2 seeps into the lake bed and dissolves into the water body, where it exists as a dense, cold layer trapped between warm layers of the water above. It's the intense pressure from the water above that allows the CO2 to dissolve in the bottom layers. And look at Lake Niles before and after the volcanic activity. You see, the water turned red, and it was a few days later that this big CO2 gas layer comes out, and it came out at night. And CO2 is heavier than oxygen, heavier than what we breathe. So it stayed low, and it went into this valley area and killed 1,700 people and the livestock down there. The lake dropped by 3 feet when that CO2 came out. If this layer becomes disturbed, then it can rapidly rise to the surface and spread to the surface area with disastrous consequences for human and animal life. The disturbance could be a landslide, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, or even increased surface runoff after a very heavy rainstorm. In the case of Lake Niles, scientists believe that it was a rapid accumulation of rainwater in the lake followed by a storm that caused the disturbance. The rainwater may have been blown to one side of the lake due to the strong August winds. The heavier rainwater sank to the bottom of the lake, causing a convective overturn, which destabilized the CO2-rich bottom layer. The result was a massive explosion of CO2 from the lake, causing the surface to drop by 1 meter. Now, to say it did turn red too, and it sure does explain a lot of things, like the death of the cattle and the people, the firstborn. They say in ancient Egypt that the firstborn son he would be the only one that would sleep in the lower level of the house. The rest of them would sleep on top. He's the guardian, so to speak, with that privileged, and the CO2 was just a few feet off the ground and stayed there. The cloud did. But it spilled over there, and then it went down into that valley, and 1,736 people, I believe, were killed. There's one of those terms, woke up dead. That was it. Mysteriously died on the evening, August 26th, 1986. This was after that eruption. See, and I'm not saying that Elohim, I just think it's a possibility he used one of those two methods, okay, to attack the gods of Egypt.
Is that meat still good?
I wouldn't.
Just CO2.
Anytime, yeah, that's true. But anytime you see an animal already dead,
Well, yeah, I wouldn't eat it 2 days later.
well, you're saying to get the fire going right now. Okay. If they understood it was CO2, they may have thought it was just some kind of plague.
Is that cattle?
That's cattle.
Wouldn't be bled properly.
Yeah, it wouldn't be bled properly. That's true.
And what?
It wouldn't be bled properly.
Yeah, that won't hurt it. Too bad.
That'd be a wild state.
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm. You lived through that.
And don't take this as me trying to explain away anything. I'm just giving these possibilities here, okay? Yeah, Elohim may have caused these natural things to happen.
But isn't that a tendency in the Old Testament, though, in the Exodus, where God is using symbolism from the paganism world?
Sure,
And, teaching them and using stuff to teach the Egyptians.
absolutely.
Something like that could be possible.
See, and I'm also trying to tell, like with the snake thing. I mean, if that's their old snake handling trick,
Yeah.
well, okay, that explains it. And I'm sure it was.
Sure.
These guys, they didn't have any real magic words, okay? But if you create that illusion, Then you're in this upper level status within the kingdom. And you stay there. And you practice that stuff. And it says that they're allegedly sons of Balaam. Balaam. So, anyway, just a thought. You know, these things get handed down. The secrets do. Verse 22 of Exodus 7, but the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened and did not listen to them as Yahweh had said. Well, the fact that magicians could duplicate this feat is, once again, it could be the algae stuff too. And they just get a glass and say, see, it's ours too. But they couldn't stop it. That's the key thing. They couldn't stop it. Pharaoh probably drank something other than water for a time, so he wasn't hurt too much. He was personally unaffected and thought, no big deal. Verse 23, then Pharaoh turned and went into his house with no concern even for this. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the Nile. And 7 days passed after Yahweh had struck the Nile. So the Egyptians searched for underground water sources to drink from. And we're told the plague lasted 7 days, or at least the next plague came 7 days later. Any questions on that?
I remember a college professor back in the early 70s. You'd asked the question earlier, can we use a natural supernatural? The professor said, if we knew everything, there's nothing, that can't be explained by all the rules of science, nature, whatever.
Right. And just because Elohim said I caused it doesn't mean that it has to start levitating and floating around the room. Okay? If he wanted to make it levitate and float around the room, he would, but he's not interested in doing tricks to entertain us. All right? That's not what he's interested in. If he said he was going to destroy a country, what would he do? He'd have another country come in and destroy them. Okay? That's what he would do. Why didn't he just get a bunch of big lightning bolts to come down and blow them up? Why didn't he do that? He didn't want to. He wanted to do it that way, right? That's his method.
You don't need explosives.
Right, he doesn't need explosives. That's correct. So to say that these plagues are manipulated natural phenomenon makes complete sense. Now, okay, you get the this red tide thing. What would all the frogs do? Get out of the water. Yes, it would. Yep. These things fit together pretty well, actually.